Welcome everyone. So we're in the middle of looking at performance art and body art. Of course, these kind of categorizations are overlapping ones. You know, there's a lot of artists who, for two reasons, a lot of artists fit in more than one category. For two reasons. One is that they're not precise categories. I mean, they overlap in many ways. It's sometimes hard to say, is this a performance art piece or is it a conceptual art piece? You know, could easily be both, and sometimes it's slightly arbitrary which heading I want to put it under. But nevertheless, I think to some extent it does help to have some kind of categories, even if at the end of the day, you know, it's like a ladder you climb up and then you kick it away once you've got there, but it helps you to get to a certain point. And the other reason why it doesn't work that well is that increasingly you find artists working in more than one medium or more than one kind of work. So even if they're studying in an art school where they have to sign up as a painting student or whatever, nevertheless you might find someone in the painting school is making videos or whatever, and anyway over the course of their working life they may end up doing all kinds of different forms of art. So I think it's a general tendency of artists to become a little less tied in their allegiance to a particular medium in recent decades. That's just part of the pattern of how things are. So we're kind of halfway looking through this theme, and we just had a little peek at this work at the end last time. Marina Abramovic, her Rhythm O or Rhythm 0, 1974. She's well known within the world of performance art. She's a sort of iconic performance artist and well known for her sort of relatively extreme performances that she's done at various points, and this is one of them, this work of 1974. Yeah, I mean, I said a little bit last time about the difference between performance art as a visual art genre and the performing arts, you know, drama, dance and so forth. There is overlap, of course, but as I said, then one of the defining differences is that performance art tends not to have a very strict script that you're working to. You know, when you're performing Hamlet, it's the same words you say and you know, in the same order every evening. And if there's a difference, it's a very minor one, and it's not one that's demanded of you. Whereas with this work, yeah, it's completely open-ended. What will happen? A certain situation is set up, and then what happens is determined partly by the audience, who are allowed to interact with Marina Abramovic herself. So that's another distinction. You know, it's sometimes in the performing arts you get some kind of interactivity with the audience. You know, especially if you're sitting in the front row, sometimes you can get dragged in various ways to a performance. Another difference is just the emphasis on the performer's body itself, the actual physical living body. Often in performing arts that's not foregrounded. You could say that's more the case in dance than theatre. Often in theatre it's about the words they're saying, you know, to be or not to be. It's not about what kind of shape of the body of the actor saying that. It's not, you know, that doesn't matter very much. You know, you could have a completely different actor saying it, and it won't make much difference. It won't make a fundamental difference. You know, okay, it would be if you had the first black Hamlet or something like that. You know, then that people would notice that you're making a point. But not the extreme emphasis on the actual physical body and sort of threat to the body in these more extreme cases. Again, there are parallels to this outside the world of art. People get very het up about the extreme quality of some performance art, but as I said last time, say in sport, for instance, there can be extreme sports like mountaineering, where there is actual physical risk to the body, even to the point of death, and that's considered acceptable. It's mankind exploring the possibilities of what can be achieved. I think even more relevant might be the parallel with certain religious practices like shamanic rituals and so forth, where physical damage to the body is done. Maybe because pain brings you back to the present moment, to the here and now. It becomes a sort of way of getting beyond minor concerns or something like that. Anyway, this work, she just let the spectators do what they like to her body using a range of props that she provided. There's a text on the wall saying, "There are 72 objects on the table that can be used on me as desired. I am the object." Well, it's a little bit like that Yoko Ono cut piece, in a way, a female body that is offered as an object deliberately for an audience that will be interactive. And in both cases it sort of sets it up that that the interaction is not necessarily going to be a particularly positive one. In her phrase there, she says, "I am the object." So there's this objectification that she herself is offering. They're not just going to sit down and have a nice chat with her or something, or hold her hand or something. It's to treat her as a thing. So she sort of set it up that way herself. So in a sense, she can't altogether complain if the audience kind of go along with that. Like with the Yoko Ono piece, yeah, they're going to cut her clothes off because there are scissors and she's inviting them to engage with her. Yeah, so what's going to happen is that her clothes are going to get cut off. Even if that kind of looks a sort of negative kind of interaction, it's something that she has predetermined. Even if you haven't scripted it, you've set certain preconditions which will send something off in a certain direction. So the objects included things like a saw, a fork, a comb, a whip, a candle, water, honey, and a gun. So some of those things are kind of tools designed to do violent or invasive things. It doesn't mean you have to use them that way, but that they're implicit in their nature, as it were. And what happened the first time she did it? It started from quite playful things, but then moved on eventually to be something close to torture. Actually, apparently she found it quite a traumatic experience. They cut her and so forth. After 6 hours, all her clothes had been taken off and a loaded gun had been put to her head. At that point, spectators, people in the audience, intervened to stop it. Actually, it's not the only time one of her performance has been stopped by people in the audience deciding to take control of something that she'd left open. She had a performance called Lips of Thomas in 1975, where she lay naked on blocks of ice that were arranged in a cross shape. And after 30 minutes, people in the audience stopped because, her body temperature would just go down and down, and death would ensue. And I think there, almost of necessity, if someone is required to intervene, it's not said that you have to, but if you didn't, then something major might happen. If you go to the Tate Gallery in London, there is this work is there in the Tate Modern, the objects and a video of the performance. So this is often, performance by their nature are unique events in time and space. So they're kind of hard to pin down. Here we are, we're just looking at still photos. You have two, so you have some sense of time, but even so, we only have a tiny fragment of the work. And in some cases, performance art pieces, we don't have any video of the whole performance. Nowadays, a lot of performance artists will carefully document what they're doing, but in the early days, that didn't tend to happen. Or it could be someone else is the artist doing their documentation of your work, so somehow it's not your perspective on it, it's their perspective. How it's going to be edited will be their choice. So it's a representation of your work in the same way as a conceptual painting is a representation of a tree. It's not the tree's own view of itself. So it's a problem for us as art historians, or just as spectators, really, to feel whether we know. Sometimes particular images of a performance piece can become very iconic and determine how we think about a performance, and there may be other aspects of the performance we don't know so well. And partly all this is chosen by the artist to make something that's evanescent, something that doesn't exist beyond the moment, but then there's the contradictory pressure to produce some documentation so people in other times and places will know what your work was, or even documentation for sale. That might be how you might make a living. So there's a kind of complexity. The documentation may be almost like an afterthought, or it seems like an afterthought, but it may be the very thing that survives. It's the only remnant of it for all but a small handful of people who were there at the original event. And of course, when you're looking at the documentation, if you're in the Tate Modern looking at the video, it's nothing like what it must have been at the actual event, because the very fact that the video is there, and that we know, if you know anything about contemporary art, you'll know Marina Abramovic is still around. In fact, she's become a sort of celebrity, hanging out with pop stars and so forth. So the sense of bodily risk is not there. We know it, well, maybe some bad things happen, but we know she's survived and she's still around. So that kind of it's not an open-ended thing. It's not that it wasn't scripted, but at the same time we know what the end was, we know it had an end that was not disastrous, anyway, put it that way. Gilbert and George. Perhaps they're better known now for their sort of photographic collage pieces, but what brought them first to public attention, these British artists, is performance. It's pretty unusual, but not completely unique, for artists to work as a pair. They work together right from art school days, and this is the work that one version of the work they became really famous for. So the singing sculpture, there's another version slightly earlier, a year earlier, called Underneath the Arches. They painted their faces in a colour. One has a walking stick, the other a glove, and they act like a role of a sort of robotic or automatons, which is an earlier. Robot is a 20th century reference. Automaton is like a sort of 18th century reference, or puppet-like movements. And then there is a tape recorder, or maybe a record player, old-style record player underneath, and they would play it again and again. And the original piece is called Underneath the Arches because that's the name of an old music hall style song that they would perform to. They mime the words, they don't sing the words are on the record. So the singing sculpture, this version I'm showing you, was performed in the Nigel Greenwood Gallery in London in 1970. It went on for 7 hours a day for 5 days during the opening hours of the exhibition. So yeah, even here too you have that kind of endurance dimension which is there in a lot of performing arts, and which Marina Abramovic really typifies in her work. And even today they dress in this very kind of bourgeois, formal way, wearing suits and ties, which is very sort of odd kind of persona to adopt. They adopt this kind of persona of kind of almost like they're bankers or something like that, very conservative, socially conservative figures. I remember once a group of us, we had some event, and then we were taken to the China Club in Central, and all of us, more or less at the same time, realised that there's the two people sitting at the next table who look conservative. Actually, some details of their clothing, like their ties, were a little kind of weird, and we suddenly realised they were Gilbert and George. But you know, it's like they were hidden in plain sight. In a way, they look so ordinary that it was a little bit hard to notice them. They were there. They were just there because they were in an exhibition at the Museum of Art. And in fact, if you track it down, they wrote an article for the Financial Times, sort of saying how terrible the Hong Kong art world was, which I think they probably knew nothing about because they were just sort of in their luxury hotel and so forth. And the China Club, someone had invited them there, that sort of thing. This is another very iconic example of early performance art, Vito Acconci, Seedbed. Well, yeah, you could call it an installation in a way, but I'm calling it a performance because he is there himself, his body is there. Just trying to find my notes about it. Yeah, well, anyway, 1971 in the Sonia Bend Gallery in New York. So it's an example of trying to produce this kind of performative art in a white cube gallery, commercial gallery setting. He's built a kind of ramp, and he himself is underneath the ramp, and he is masturbating in kind of in a sort of dialogue, sexualized dialogue with whatever spectators have come into the gallery, which he can't see, but he can hear them over him. So this is a very kind of unusual kind of audience and artist interaction. They can't see him either, but they can hear him because there is a microphone, a loudspeaker up near the ceiling, I think, which you can hear his voice and what he happens to say. So there's kind of a very weird kind of interaction that is both very, very intimate in a sense, but also distanced. And it's very much about the artist's body. That's why I'm presenting it as maybe a performance rather than just as an installation. Originally he thought about maybe going above the ceiling or building a wall and being behind the wall, but then he settled on going under the floor. And the microphone was a later idea, just because people couldn't hear him. It turned out that people couldn't hear him underneath the ramp, so he installed that. But that changed the whole work. So then the work becomes, the voice becomes sort of disembodied. It's coming from a separate place than his actual body. So it's not just about his actual body. It's that kind of there's a distance quality to it. And of course, because of the nature of the activity involved, then this became a very notorious piece about the terrible things that modern artists do. He himself, he was in Hong Kong he had an exhibition at Parasite Art Space with Ai Weiwei. The two of them together had this exhibition, and he gave a talk. But they both gave a talk before, and he said that this work was better as a rumor than in reality. Somehow even he himself kind of drew back a little bit from it. Just to give you some idea of the other works that he did. He had one work where he was following people in the street. You just pick a random stranger and he would sort of follow them, and then a video camera would follow him to document his following. Although one thing we learnt was that actually that was a sort of fabrication. He remade the work later with the video. The video camera wasn't there in the original time that he did that work. And more recently he's done more a kind of architectural, sculptural or architectural work rather than performing arts. That's a common pattern. Like Dennis Oppenheim we were looking at last week, he in his later work was more architectural in nature. Had a kind of design business really. There he is, underneath the ramp. Doesn't look like fun. Rebecca Horn, Finger Gloves, 1972. German artist, but she spent a kind of important year in New York in I think it was 1972. So connected with what was happening in American context. A lot of her artworks are like this. They involve some kind of prosthetic, an extension of the human body in some way that therefore controls what the human body can do. It starts to behave differently. And then there would be video documentation of her using this. So for example, there's one where she's a unicorn, has a big sort of horn, extended horn on her head, and she's walking around in a sort of parkland setting in the early morning. Here it's arm extensions. You think of prosthesis as some sort of like a medical device that help people do things they can't otherwise do, but here it's more about hindering than helping. It's making you reconsider things you take for granted. But now here's some issue that comes up with performance art for me is to what extent we as the audience are able to identify with it. I feel that performance art is really a different thing from the perspective of the audience and from the perspective of the performer. Like only Marina Abramovic is feeling the actual pain. She's going through a certain kind of really extreme range of experiences, and one could imagine that would be, have an immense effect on you. Hopefully, a good one, an empowering one. But it's very different from the response you're having as a passive spectator. Okay, that you could be an active spectator in that case of her work. But here with Rebecca Horn, her experience of how her hands, she feels differently about her hands, is very different from ours. Whereas with a stage play, it's different. There's no inside. There is no actual Hamlet who kills someone. It's not. The actor just presents as if that were happening. But whereas with performance art, the as ifness has disappeared. So is that a limitation of performance art? Possibly. That we're still just on the outside, looking at something in a very literal way. Maybe we could experience an emotion much better if an artist, say, used an expressionistic style to try to represent that emotion, whether it's a Rothko style or a Van Gogh style. No matter what, maybe we can get inside the emotion more easy. It's left to us with performance art to do the work of trying to kind of empathize, try to see it from the inside. Anna Mendieta, from her Silhouette series. She does a whole series of these works in the 1970s where she's adopting a certain she's having a sort of dialogue with the ground in different ways, a kind of ritualized dialogue with the ground, which creates this sort of shape that is equivalent of her body shape, and she puts her body in it, so there's a kind of performative dimension. And then the photograph here is just showing what's left afterwards. So silhouette, so Spanish for silhouette, I suppose. So beyond the female body, of course, is a major object in art. The reification of the female body, or the turning of it into something for the male spectator's gaze. Well, someone like Marina Abramovic or Yoko Ono is sort of playing with that by kind of deliberately taking on that passive role, but in order to somehow undermine it. And Anna Mendieta is also kind of subverting it, getting away from the commodification, the fetishization of the female body. It's sort of present here as absent in a way. It's like a kind of death rebirth ritual of connecting to the earth. She herself says, "I've been carrying out a dialogue between the landscape and the female body based on my own silhouette. I believe that this has been a direct result of my having been torn from my homeland, Cuba, during my adolescence. My art is the way I re-establish the bonds that unite me to the universe. Through my earth body sculptures, I become one with the earth. I become an extension of nature, and nature becomes an extension of my body." So how much is about the result and how much is about the process, the performance? Yeah, just another example in a different environment. A lot of the time these things it's a variation on things that we ourselves have experienced. If you've ever been in a snowy environment, and people like to make these snow angel patterns of things. The Gia Clark, The I and the You, Clothing, Body Clothing, 1967. Brazilian artist. Here it's not about her body, it's about the user's body. She's creating clothes, what she calls them relational objects or vestimentary sculptures. So it's sort of clothing for two people to wear at the same time. And it's meant to have a kind of therapeutic role. Two people have a kind of umbilical connection. As you can see, each of them are kind of blindfolded. They can't see the other person. But each costume has sort of zips in it, which they can expose to, and they get experiences of, within these sort of pocket spaces. There are kind of different objects with different feels. It's as much tactile, well, more tactile than visual, since they're blindfolded. Of course, there's a role also for the spectator looking from the outside. So there may be some kind of something made of rubber, or there may be a plastic bag with water in it or something. It's designed for a male-female couple. Well, a slight a typographic error on the sheet. So this is Coco Fusco. There's an O left out. Coco Fusco with Guillermo Gomez Pena. Two undiscovered Amerindians visiting Madrid, 1992. So 1992 is actually the 250th anniversary of the discovery. Sorry, 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. So they're going to Spain, to the place from which the discovery happened, and they're playing the role of being, sort of newly discovered tribal people put on display. Of course, that sort of thing has happened many times. Specimens of living people have been brought back to be put on display in Europe. In mid-19th century London, you could pay a sum to go and see a Chinese sampan lady, so-called, and there's a reifying of the cultural other. Even during the same kind of time that this work was being done, there was some case of a supposedly a new undiscovered tribe that was come to light in the Philippines. Later it was turned out to be, it was all of kind of a fake. So these sort of things go on. So they're playing at being these sort of specimens from far away, and they pretended to have their own language. Of course, I guess most people looking at it realize it's not for real, but if it's presented in this kind of context, maybe it's a little bit difficult at first to realize what's going on. And anyway, since it's just presented in a city public space, it doesn't have the notion that this is art. It's not presented to you necessarily as art. I know they did do this in a gallery setting as well. They did it in the Whitney Museum in New York, where everyone will know they're looking at art, but when people come up, like this little girl coming up, does she know she's looking at art? Does she know that she's looking at something that is a performance of some kind? Even if the grown-ups realize there's something not quite right about this. So a kind of provocative approach to the audience. Well, Damien Hirst, he's a perfect example of an artist that could come in different categories. But I'm putting him in here as well because, I'm trying to make this sort of shift a little bit from talking about performance to talking about a category you might call body art, which is not necessarily involving performance, but is still centered on the body. Though with Damien Hirst, it's not the human body, and I think that's also an interesting point to make, that body art doesn't necessarily involve the human body. So all this is almost doesn't need to be explained. It's also so famous, his presenting of a pickled shark or a cow, or in this case a pig or sheep, different animals in vitrines, preserved. I suppose there's something a bit odd about preserving that which is dead, but it invokes scientific display. There are certainly museums you can go to where you see specimens in jars to look at, especially cutting the pig in half, so you see the patterns of the internal organs, almost like in a diagram. Life and death, it's a big theme. When he's doing the cow, that also relates to the fact at that time was the time of mad cow disease in the UK. Everyone was really worried about the contaminated meat from the kind of feed that the animals had been given could lead to us all going crazy who'd eaten hamburgers or whatever during that time. I believe the last time I checked, I can't give blood in Hong Kong because I was in the UK at that time. I don't know whether it still applies, but that was that sort of fear was very widespread. In fact, it turned out only a few people had this so-called mad cow disease, but at a certain point there was a worry that it might be all over the place. Loads of people may be getting it. So that's a kind of site-specific, or at least temporally specific context of meaning that I guess would be gradually lost over time, only recoverable by us art historians. Mark Quinn, another British artist of the same generation. This is his most famous work, I suppose, Self, of 1991. It's a cast portrait of his own head, like a life mask, or sometimes they make death masks as well. That kind of, it's like a pre-photographic indexical portraiture means being used. That's not unusual, but what is unusual is the material the portrait is made of, which is his own blood. He gradually, over a number of months, over 5 months, he collected his own blood, had it extracted and frozen, kept 8 pints of it, which is about average to the amount of blood in an adult male body anyway, and then use the blood cast as his head, and it's, of course, blood is liquid at room temperature, so it's in a refrigeration unit, so one has a sense of, here is a portrait that is only held in place by extreme effort. If you stop the refrigeration, the portrait will disappear. So there's that sense of sort of slight fragility about it. But of course the main strangeness of it is the idea of a portrait made of blood, and some people might, in front of the actual object, might find this is slightly unpleasant experience that they don't really want to have. I'm hoping you're not getting that experience just looking at an illustration. But there again, this is about the difference between the reality and reproductions that I was talking about in relation to performance art. So it's an index. It's actually a body product. It's part of himself, representing himself with his actual self. In some sense, it's an emanation from him. It's a little bit like the notion of a religious relic, where some part of a saint's body is kept in a church or something, and sometimes it's encased in a reliquary which recovers the iconic sort of shape of the body. Yeah, so that's the view with the whole thing, the refrigeration unit, which raises the head up towards, I think it's about this height. It's not up to head height. Yeah. So
I read about this work that Mark Quinn didn't want it to be a sort of historical representation of him at that time in 1991.
Yeah.
And as part of the works, sort of papers that works that have it, he remakes it every, I think, 5 or 10 years.
Oh really? No, I didn't
and
know
he
that.
casts himself again to keep the portrait of the artist as sort of real as it can be, and he doesn't want it to be a representation of him at that time. So.
Well, I think it does still have that sort of photographic quality of freezing a certain moment, because it's like a cast that's directly from the body, right? So he's not just sculpted it to look like himself to a certain point. So it's kind of actually a trace of him. Even if he changes it over time, he's not changing it. It's not changing in real time or something like that. I don't know how that can be done, but so I think the same kind of point applies in a way. It's like updating your passport photo or something. You know, ID card photo. You could do that, but it's still kind of going to be get out of date people. So you have a sense of the past about it, the way you do with any photo. Even if it's a photo of something happened a month ago, you have a sense of almost of loss or of the past about it. But if you're making it of your actual body, then that gives you a sense of presence that counterbalances that in a way.
Yeah, I suppose you could argue it's almost like a process artwork in which it will continue to look different until the artist himself dies, and then and then it's like a timeline, portrait.
Yeah. So the owner of this has a commitment from the artist that they're allowed that he will update it. I don't know, or is it just a scam to
read something like that? I'm not sure. But I think because at one point I think it like melted anyway.
Oh yeah, well so it could have started because of something like that where it required remaking. Yeah, I could easily imagine that might be the case.
Well, another bodily fluid and another kind of shock artwork, Andreas Serrano's Piss Christ, 1987. So no prizes for guessing what kind of bodily fluid is involved, as the title kind of gives it away. It's an image of Christ on the cross within the artist's own urine. He himself actually is a Catholic, so the first take of this work is to say, oh, this is some sort of anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, anti-religious kind of bad boy kind of work. But at least in terms of the artist's expressed intentions, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Actually, crucifixion itself is a terrible insult to a body. But that is already part of the Christian story, and it's accepted. So, this is only one further step of a degradation of a degradation, if you want to put it that way. Sacred and profane, or some kind of contract like that. Mona Hatoum, Corpse Étranger, 1994. So that's like a French title, but like foreign body, you could say. And foreign body in two sense. It's actually about her own. I'm sorry, no, I don't have another close-up, but it's about her own body. And what she's done is made a video of the interior of her own body, and it's actually getting very close to her own body, but because it's the interior of her body, it's something that is strange even to her. It's unknown even to her. It's also foreign body. The title would refer to the camera, which is inserted into her body as a foreign body, something that shouldn't normally be there. So it's like a sort of medical camera that would be used for, say, a colonoscopy investigation or something like that. So making use of medical technology for artistic purposes. So the first orifice is her mouth, and you just get the video of a camera going into 3 different places of her body, one after the other. So it's like not just laying herself bare in front of the audience, but even her most private interior spaces are laid bare, made public. But in a way, it's kind of like over-fulfilling any voyeuristic expectation a viewer might have. It's kind of too much information, as it were, in more than anyone who would want. So it sort of deconstructs voyeurism in that sense. She presents the video within this interior structure. We're on the outside looking in. And it because it's such a close-up of an unfamiliar part of the body becomes a sort of strange landscape in a way. It's not the body as we normally think of it. It's not the body as seen from the outside, but it's not even the body as we feel it from the side of living inside a body, which is a completely different experience. It's neither of those things. Orlan, Omnipresence, 1993. Well, she makes plastic surgery to her own body, the medium of her artwork. So you could call this performative too, because she tends to work with only local anesthetic, so she can actually be conscious during the whole process and sort of in some sense in charge of the whole process. So remaking her body, after models of art or something like that. Over a whole sort of sequence of things over time that she's done interventions with the involvement of surgeons who are sympathetic to this idea. Well, it's blurring the line because a lot of plastic surgery anyway is pretty much, not necessary. It's just done for aesthetic reasons. Well, if we're talking about aesthetics, then why not art? That's Stellark. I think the first Australian artist that I've shown you on this course. The Third Hand, 1976 to 80. Well, again, working with engineers, with technicians to kind of alter the body as if there were a third hand. I think he's controlling it from his feet. He had to learn how to control it from his feet, if I've understood it correctly. Again, it's like Rebecca Horn, it's about prosthesis. And this sort of technology has really moved on, again, in medical context to replace limbs that have been lost, even to the point where, nowadays you can have mental control of prosthetic limbs and so forth. The technology is becoming very sophisticated. But at this point in time, he's engaging with what is the growing edge of science and technology about these matters. He did another one, I think must have been much later than this one, when the internet arrived, where audience members were able to control his limbs for him online. I mean, all these things have become kind of normal now. There's so many things you can do. But like when the internet first came, it was really exciting that there was a work called Light on the Net, and there's just a collection of lights installed in a shopping mall in Japan, and you could go online and switch them on and off in different patterns. As sometimes there were other people also trying to switch them on and off, and you were sort of competing with them, and you see the people in the lobby who were going by actually seeing the lights. In a sense, it sort of sounds trivial now, but when that first became the possibility, it seemed kind of very, very exciting somehow. Or you could go and control the movement of a robot that was in some lab, and get it to go and tell a joke to the scientists in the lab, and all this seemed very, very sort of unusual. I think that's one of the difficulties of working with technology, is because the edge is growing all the time. Like I think I said before, how 1980s computer art seems so slow. Even 1990s computer art can seem so slow, and kind of weirdly slow. But at the time, it was as fast as it could be. That's what it was. Here he is again, Stellark. Event for Stretched Skin, 1976. So a little bit like a kind of torture, but also, like certain religious contexts where people sort of push themselves to extreme experiences, flagellating themselves. There's even people in the Philippines who crucify themselves to experience what it must be like for Jesus being crucified, that sort of thing. Linda Montano and Tehching Hsieh, Art Life 1 Year Performance, 83 to 84, the rope piece. He liked to do these 1 year long performances. In this case, it's a collaboration. It required a collaboration with Linda Montano. And it's a very simple thing. They are just tied together by a rope for the entire length of the 1 year performance piece. Other works, you may know other works. There was one where he had to punch a clock every hour for a year. He could go anywhere he liked, but he had to be back in time to punch the clock. He could sleep, but he had to wake up to punch the clock. Again, it's like some kind of extreme religious, spiritual practice of trying to change your state by totally making you outside your normal routine. You can't be living a little kind of wage slave, worker bee lifestyle if you're going to do something like this. You can't, you're bound to be pushed into a different pattern of life. Another one where he had to stay out of doors all year, wasn't allowed to be indoors at any time during the year. This was all done in New York, where he'd arrived in America from Taiwan originally, arrived in America as an illegal immigrant. And when he was doing that year out of doors, he actually got arrested and got in trouble. This one was completed, but I understand that they didn't become really, really close after this. They didn't spend a lot of time together after the year. I think they have to. The rule is they have to stay in the same room or something like that.
They can't touch each other.
They can't touch each other. Yeah, that's another rule. So it's almost like a legal contract. The artworks defines itself like a legal contract between them, or in a sense between them and the viewers. They promise that they will do this. So other people had to sort of help them, either being a kind of witness or to bring them food. Like there's a Hong Kong performance artist called Kwok Mang Ho. Sometimes he's called Frog King. He was also an illegal immigrant in New York at that time, and he was one of the people who helped Tehching Hsieh buy food, cook food when he was spending his year out of doors. They were friends. So again, how much do we get as spectators? I'm sure it would be, for better or worse, a life-transforming experience to spend a year roped to another person that you didn't know particularly well. But what can we get from it, just looking at a picture of it, or even if there was a video? How much are we going to get? We're not going to, we might get more from watching a 2-hour play about two people who were roped together for a year. That might actually tell us more about what the experience was like than looking through, even if there never was such two people, that the play, was purely a fictional event. So again, quite extreme experience. Oops, sorry. Let's take our break there.